that the share is working.
It's working. We can see it. Yeah.
All right, great. Before attempting to explore my current thoughts about an ancient indigenous Tennessee foodway, let me clarify the difference between food and foodways. Food is a relatively simple concept. It's what we eat. And as the adage goes, we all know we are what we eat. For food, we can simply take a menu approach and just list what we eat. But as approached in the social sciences, a foodway is a much broader concept. It includes the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food. So not just what we eat. Foodways engages us with the intersection of culture, traditions, and history. From this perspective, we're not just what we eat. We are also how and why we acquired what we're eating, how and why we prepared what we're eating, and how and why we consumed it in certain ways with certain people. And it also applies to why we didn't acquire certain foods, why we didn't prepare them in certain ways, and why we didn't eat them with certain people. In other words, when we approach food as part of a foodway, we're going to be engaged in examining virtually every aspect of our social and cultural lives. Amongst my responsibilities at Middle Tennessee State University, I serve as coordinator of our Native American Studies minor. As a result, I often pursue the creation of new courses that focus on topics of current significance to Native Americans and students of Native Americans. Over the past several years, indigenous peoples of the United States, and indeed the world, have renewed their focus on traditional foodways as part of cultural revitalization movements and health initiatives. These new restaurants and their menus are not just the menu approach. They're largely being generated from initiatives that engage a foodways approach, engaging with the cultural reasons that the food is important to the people and their cultures. So 3 years ago, when I developed a new course on Native American foodways, the influences began to lap over into my interpretations of prehistory as well. Here on out, I'll focus primarily on a single late prehistoric Mississippian polity that I've worked on for over 20 years now, and how the notions of foodways in my interdisciplinary research with botanists and zoologists have shifted my thoughts over the past few years. This community was established as a small village about AD 1100. Around AD 1275, with the arrival of a small group of immigrants from the southern periphery of the Cahokian polity, the indigenous residents transformed their community into the capital of a chiefdom that controlled most of modern Sumner and Smith counties in Tennessee. The reconstruction painting is by James Miller, my friend and co-author of Choctaw Descent, who joined his ancestors just before my excavations at the Castalian Springs site began. The lower right is an image I discovered in the William Edward Meyer papers in the National Anthropological Archives, part of the Smithsonian Institution. It shows his crew excavating in Mound 2 at Castalian Springs in 1916, the primary platform mound of this settlement, the base of which is roughly the size of a football field, to give you some scale. The environmental setting or ecosystem where people live obviously strongly affects their foodways. Agriculturalists, like the citizens of Castalian Springs polity, do modify part of their environment to produce crops, but much of the rest of the foodway is determined by what is available in the local ecosystem. We have ample evidence of extensive use of maize in the diet at the site. Currently, we have no evidence of beans, which may not have been introduced into the Nashville area until after this settlement was abandoned between 1325 and 1350. As some of you will also perhaps recall, I also directed 5 seasons of archaeological research at Bledsoe's Fort, just across the road, as part of the development of Sumner County's first historical park. Established in 1783 as one of the first 8 fortified Euro-American and Afro-American settlements in Middle Tennessee, that project provides an intriguing point of comparison for foodways by a different group of farmers at essentially the same location, but 4 centuries later. And therein lies the rub. The early historical documents clearly tell us that the Cumberland River Valley from Nashville eastward was dominated by an ecosystem that was driven nearly to extinction within only a few decades. What they called cane breaks, but should perhaps more rightly be termed cane forests. Archaeologists have long recognized that Mississippian peoples throughout much of the southeastern and midwestern United States used American bamboo, cane, as elements of architecture, portable material culture such as mats and basketry. However, because of the near and deliberate extermination of the canebrake ecosystem, archaeologists and historians, including me, have perhaps underestimated the potential centrality of that ecosystem for indigenous pre-contact cultures. No living scholars have ever experienced that ecosystem in person. So perhaps we're to be forgiven for not realizing that our interpretations fall short of the likely reality. For those who aren't familiar with this plant, a brief overview. River cane or giant cane is one of perhaps 3 species of the genus Arundinaria, the only indigenous bamboo species of the southeastern United States. One modern biologist has estimated that by about 1700 AD, cane brakes covered as much as 10 million acres of the southeast. In 1995, the Department of the Interior listed cane brakes as one of America's most critically endangered ecosystems, having been reduced to less than 2% of their original abundance. Following that designation as a critically endangered ecosystem, scientists of all kinds turned their attention to river cane for the first intensive look for most of us. They partnered in many instances with Native American tribes who still greatly value this diminishing resource. A few decades later, we are still only beginning to learn about the biology and life cycle of giant cane. We do know that many of the small stands surviving today are single organisms. The culms, which is the proper name for the stalks that we see above ground, are rising from a single interconnected root system. Another nearly unique characteristic of bamboo worldwide is the typical cycle of flowering and producing seed only every 30 to 160 years, depending on the species. And most stands die after producing their seed. For Arundinaria, we simply have not studied it long enough. We don't know yet what factors precipitate the flowering or what the length of the flowering cycle might be if it is indeed managed by a genetic clock like many bamboos. But we do know that because many stands are single organisms, the small stands that survive today, the entire stand dies after seeding. Early accounts of river travel and exploration invariably mention cane breaks in the southeast along the shoreline of rivers, often extending continuously for many miles. But cane was not restricted to the bottomlands. The continuous series of bluffs, for example, along the Mississippi River stretching from Kentucky to Louisiana, including the Chickasaw Bluffs, were formerly known as the Cane Hills, consisting of hardwood forests with a dense understory growth of cane. In the past, culms were frequently reported as 10 to 12 meters tall and up to 10 centimeters in diameter. So over 30 feet tall and up to 4 inches or more in diameter. The longest culm reliably reported in 1775 was 47 feet tall. Today, the more typical size in our marginalized small cane stands is 15 to 20 feet in height and about 1.5 inches in diameter. Just for a few examples of the small stands, there are many left. These small stands usually along fence lines, fence rows, between railroads and highways. This one is a small mature stand in Putnam County. Another more typical small stand like this one, coincidentally or not, at the Beasley Mounds, Mississippian site in Smith County. Or this small stand in Sevier Park in Davidson County, also not too far distant from the Mississippi Mound Center. Some of the shorter cane stands in the Appalachians elsewhere are a different species of Arundinaria than giant cane or river cane. The upper one here is what is called hill cane or arrow cane by the Cherokee, recognizable by the small lumen, the little tiny hole in the center. The lower is giant cane or river cane. The tallest I have been able to find in recent years is the cane forest at Oconaluftee Islands Park in Cherokee, North Carolina. It is advertised as river cane or Arundinaria. I have not been able to verify that it actually is, but that is certainly not implausible. But it gives you a clear sense of the size and height, something of the feeling of what it must have been like to see these cane forests in the ancient days. A few more quotations from some early documents to give us a sense of what the Cumberland River was like. John Filson, 1784, visiting Kentucky, wrote, "The buffaloes were more frequent than I have seen cattle in the settlements, browsing on the leaves of the cane. Sometimes we saw hundreds in a drove, and the numbers about the salt springs were amazing." For the Cumberland River Valley, Albert Goodpasture wrote that both bottom and upland were covered with cane and timber, except at a few spots. The cane breaks in the rich bottoms rose from 10 to 20 feet in height. William Hall, later governor of Tennessee, described the cane break at Castalian Springs, where he lived most of his life. His and other descriptions tell us that in 1780, the Lick Creek Valley, next to the mound site, was covered with a continuous cane break at least 5 miles in length, covering both the bottomlands and the hillsides. And Castalian Springs is 4 miles away from the Cumberland River, far up the drainage of Bledsoe Creek and actually on a secondary tributary. But William Hall, pursued by Native Americans, the 13-year-old was able to make his way through the cane break, but his adult pursuers could not. It was too dense. They were forced to follow indirectly by the buffalo trails and along the hilltops where the cane was thinnest. And if we go back further in time, upon first visitation by American explorers in the 1760s, Bledsoe's Lick, later to be known as Castalian Springs, was reported as filled with bison, more than I have ever seen. The rich cane breaks were undoubtedly what drew the bison to the Cumberland River Valley, out of the plains in the 1500s and 1600s. Later, cane would be described as the highest yielding native pasturage in the southeast. And most of us have probably heard of the Caney Fork River, tributary of the Cumberland, to the east of Castalian Springs. It was so named for the dense and impenetrable canebrake that made travel almost impossible for the early settlers. Because of the danger of piercing the horse's legs if cut low, they determined to cut off the heavy, leafy tops of the cane and then press their teams and wagons over them to flatten. The terms cane and caney can be found in hundreds of place names from Oklahoma eastwards, telling us something of the once wide distribution and significance of the canebrakes. Now, let's proceed backwards in time, 4 centuries and more, and examine the archaeological evidence from the mounds. Archaeologists have long recognized that cane was a key element of architecture during the Mississippian era. These fragments are of wall plaster, showing the imprints of woven splint cane mats and stringers over which the clay plaster was applied. This fragment of wall plaster from the Mississippian village beneath Travelers Rest in Davidson County still exhibits some carbonized fragments of the woven cane. These fragments of cane impressed plaster have been documented at many, if not most, of the Mississippian sites along the Cumberland River. But our research at the Castalian Mounds suggested it was more important than we previously imagined. First, let's take a look at the archaeological evidence from Structure 1, a large early temple at the site that's shown circled in red here, or at least our excavation units. Our research design carefully focused on documenting every aspect of the way the structures were built. These revealed wall trenches containing very small diameter posts, as you can see here. Maybe there's also a tattoo in there as well. So these post holes are what's left from where posts were in place. The holes themselves are about a little under 4 inches in diameter. So the posts were probably about 3.5 inches in diameter. Structure 1 was a major building, a major temple or workshop, rebuilt several times over the course of a little over a century from our many radiocarbon dates. It grew larger and larger each time it was rebuilt, reaching eventually some 1,300 square feet in interior square footage. Rather than the typical 4-post frame used for many Mississippian houses from the 1400s, we have argued that this large building was constructed using bent pole techniques. The size of the holes is precisely that of the large columns documented in the very early historic period. So we believe that this structure was not only contained cane mats, but also structure itself was largely made of bent canes. In fact, all of the large buildings at Castalian Springs appear to have been constructed of bent cane poles, including the 2 temples atop Mound 3, circled here in red. At the left, you can see two wall trenches intersecting at the corner of the building. So we have two coming together. There was a clay cap that was placed over the entire mound after the temples were intentionally dismantled and removed. When that clay cap was peeled away, these small vacant post holes were revealed. Again, their size perfectly consistent with the use of bent cane poles. These larger holes are partly the result of rodent burrowing in the wall trench. Within this temple, we recovered the fragments of a negative painted female effigy bottle, a hallmark of the Cumberland River Valley. On the right is the missing Meyer rattle, last seen in Illinois in 1937. It was recovered at Castalian Springs site in the 1890s. We have argued that the religion that used these bottles as ritual paraphernalia was first created, brought together at Castalian Springs, but it later expanded and spread throughout much of the Midwest and interior South. Negative painted design on the female bottles, another one shown at left here, was originally a male tattoo or painted motif depicted on rain shell cups made at Cahokia, Illinois. The design from one of those shell cups is shown in the center here. When the motif arrived at Castalian Springs, it survived briefly as a male motif. It is engraved on this incredible sandstone figurine about 4 inches tall, shown here, recovered again 1890s from Castalian Springs. While it may not be very visible, he is indeed engraved with the same design that we see on the other two. But at Castalian Springs, it was quickly reinterpreted and transformed into a female garment. Now, back to River Cane. This Works Progress Administration experimental reconstruction of a bent pole square building should give you some additional insights into the potential of bent pole architecture. And a few other interpretations, other plastered Mississippian houses from a variety of sites open to the public around the Southeast. And to look at one more example, the top mound 2, that giant platform mound, football field sized, circled here in red where our excavation units were in 2010. We found extensive evidence of the use of cane mats as interior partitions of this building, and perhaps as elements of the roof. The structure burned so hotly that the floor was turned into pottery, and you can see the bright orange on the sidewalls here that are fragments of burned wall plaster. There's a fragment of that cane matting after we removed it from the floor very carefully to package for future detailed study. Unfortunately, most of the things that would have been made of split cane don't survive in your average archaeological site. Upriver, the dry rock shelters along the Cumberland River have been heavily looted for centuries for the organic treasures they contain. At the upper left, a fragment of cane mat recovered from a rock shelter in Smith County. And this extraordinary double weave cane box from a rock shelter on the Cumberland in eastern Kentucky, now preserved in the Smithsonian Institution, where I photographed it, shown on the upper right here. There are tantalizing hints of the extraordinary capabilities of Mississippian basket weavers and cane weavers in general. Some of the mats in private collections are as much as 10 to 12 feet long and 4 to 5 feet in width, documenting those private collections and trying to move them into places where they can be preserved is another of my long-term projects. William Bartram in 1791 reported finding cane breaks that extended for miles, covering the landscape like an ocean, in his words. In a Florida village, he described a level platform all covered with carpets or mats, curiously woven of split canes dyed of various colors. And we'll see some of those dyed baskets in a bit. The council fire the Muskogee, he described as being made of bundles of dry canes of a size to burn the length of time the council was supposed to meet. Sort of a hourglass of cane. Elsewhere, he writes of an indigenous wedding ceremony where the bride and groom exchanged canes as evidence or certificates of the marriage. Father Petit described cane baskets of an oval shape in the Mississippi Valley, and in these are enclosed the bones of their ancient chiefs. So those examples give us some notion of the significance that cane played in so many different aspects of life. And maybe the furnishings were more luxurious in terms of furniture than we have typically visualized. In 1682, Henry de Tonty wrote, "I was surprised to find their cabins made of mud and covered with cane mats. These old men showed me a small cabinet within the wall made of mats of cane. Desiring to see what was inside, the old men prevented me, giving me to understand that their God was there." So cane provided the enclosure for the ancestors' bones, for representations of the gods, and for everyone else still alive. And if we need some music to go along with anything, flutes were made of cane. We have both archaeological and a lengthy historical example of cane flutes. Well, having demonstrated something of the breadth of significance of cane, we can also note that it was historically used to provide fiber for weaving moccasins, as hairpins, fuel, knives, lighting, as both candles and torches. All of the torches, prehistoric torches known from the explorations of dark zone cave art caves, Tennessee, were explored using cane torches. But they were also used for medicine, war spears. But by now, you might be wondering, where's the foodway in all of this? So cane was also historically used for blowguns and the darts used in them, arrow shafts, bows. So now we get to the procurement of certain kinds of food. And there were other aspects. We go back to records of the DeSoto expedition in October 1540. The Spanish crossed the Alabama River on rafts of cane and dry wood. John Swanton noted John Swanton being one of the greatest ethnographers of southeastern Native Americans, noted that cane knives were the most ubiquitous type of artifact mentioned in historical literature from the southeast. 1758, Page de Prats noted that the canes are so hard that these people used split portions of these canes with which to cut their meat before the French brought them knives. Now to dinner proper. Although cane forests of the extent described in the early records are not available yet for us to observe and study, Steve Platt and Chris Brantley reconstructed a list of species garnered from scattered historical documents, species that were recorded as living in the canebrake ecosystem. You probably can't read this, so let's take a quick spin through some photographs. Many reptiles, including the American alligator, dozens and dozens of bird species, including the now extinct passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet at upper right, that found canebrakes a remarkable source of food, as well as numerous songbirds that only reproduce in cane stands, 4 of which are hence critically endangered as well as the ecosystem. Our more birds documented. Rodents of all kinds. Most of our small to medium-sized mammals, including our beavers that we'll get back to in a minute. And our larger mammals as well. And of course, the bison that we discussed earlier. In fact, if we compare the list of species represented by food bones at the Mississippi and mound sites of the Cumberland Valley, we find that they are essentially the same list, except for that alligator. The meat preferences of Mississippian peoples have been explained by 2 main models, the forest edge model and the garden hunting model. Here, I suggest for the Cumberland Valley, we may need to add one more factor to the mix, the cane forest model. One perplexing thing about Castalian Springs and some other Mississippian sites is the extraordinary percentage of eastern box turtles that were being harvested, eaten, and used perhaps to make rattles, like these Chickasaw rattles shown at the right. The canebrake ecosystem is the ideal habitat for the box turtle, so much so that I have an unprovable suspicion that the box turtle was formerly primarily found in the cane forests of the southeast. All that being said, following the suggestion of Steve Platt, I've also turned to ethnoarchaeology in my re-examination of the Cumberland Valley Mississippians. The hill cultures of Southeast Asia have been called bamboo cultures by some cultural anthropologists, and particularly ethnobotanists. While the diversity of bamboo is much greater in that part of the world, I suggest that a more thorough examination of those cultures may enable us to more reliably re-examine, reimagine the Mississippians of the Cumberland River Valley, and perhaps elsewhere, as a southeastern bamboo culture. I'll give you a whirlwind tour of just some examples of the dominance of bamboo in the material culture of these hill communities. So here we have a woman splitting cane columns on the left, a gentleman using those to bind together the frame of a house on the right, roof made from split cane column sections, admittedly of larger cane than we ever had here. And then on the right, a bridge, which I might be reluctant to try in person, but I'll volunteer any of you for it. Others, plenty of examples. Here, a marriage house made entirely of bamboo, irrigation system, made of split bamboo. The hafts of tools, agricultural tools, crossbow, animal traps, chicken cage there at the lower left, and the inevitable baskets. So to move towards closing off, I did want to mention one of the most expansive river canyon initiatives that I'm aware of that started several years ago is the Cherokee Nation River Canyon Initiative. Proposed originally by Roger Kane, shown here, but has now grown to be a much larger project in both Oklahoma and North Carolina, documenting using GIS the locations of all the cane stands on tribal lands and beginning the process of what they hope will be the restoration of cane forests. Cane is important culturally to the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes for its cultural significance. There are only a few river cane basket weavers left, and it has become increasingly difficult for them to find the materials to manufacture these, what many of them now consider more works of art, preserving cultural traditions than simply utilitarian items. Well, my note here says time permitting. I still have a couple of minutes left. I mentioned beaver ponds and cornfields in my abstract. Lineback and Knight recently argued that the North American beaver was critical to providing the necessary habitat in the Alabama Black Prairie to produce corn to support indigenous populations, Mississippian populations encountered by DeSoto. In segments of intermittent streams and seasonally dry environments, like this stream of Lick Creek next to the Castalian Springs Mounds, beaver meadows can sometimes create stable, perennial aquatic habitats. Over time, they fill with sediments. Once abandoned, these beaver meadows persist as rich soils ideally suited for river cane and maize. At Castalian Springs and other Mississippian towns along the Cumberland, we only find rare evidence of the consumption of beavers, despite the fact that they were certainly populous here. Indigenous people seem to have respected the beaver's work, creating fields as more beneficial than their value as a food source. The large 8-foot thick deposits of alluvial soil along Lick Creek are unlikely to have been created by this minor tributary. So if we extend Lineback and Knight's arguments to this tributary, the so-called floodplain soils of these little tributary creeks in the uplands were largely created by thousands of years of beaver occupation. Indeed, in my 1995 excavations of Lick Bottom, at the depth of about 8 feet, I recovered a beaver bone and snapping turtle shell fragments, suggesting that it was already a beaver pond at the end of the Ice Age. The beaver bone was intermediate in size between the giant beavers of the Ice Age and modern beavers, but was certainly within or just above the Pleistocene era sediment, and at approximately the same depth as the mastodon encountered in 1818, just a few yards away during the excavation of the salt well. This beaver dam is from just a couple of years ago on Lick Creek, only a short distance away from the mounds themselves. And finally, in the last year or so, Dwayne Estes, professor of biology at Austin Peay State University, director of the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, documented a stand of Hortulan plum at the Old Town Mounds, another Mississippian site that I work with. It's only the second he's seen in Tennessee. It's outside its natural habitat, Missouri, in the Midwest. He and I both believe that the ancestors of these fruit trees were brought here during the Mississippian period by people who lived at Old Town. Perhaps part of that same migration of people from southeast Missouri and western Kentucky, the Nashville area, about 1250 AD. And to close off, the Chickasaw plum was among the first fruits to be domesticated in North America. This is a different variety of plum. First noted in 1608 by Jamestown colonist William Strachey, and noted numerous times. By 1890, the Forked Deer Nurseries of Tennessee marketed a Chickasaw plum that was soft, juicy, of fine quality, under the alias of Minor. Despite compelling evidence that this native plum species was prehistorically selected and cultivated by indigenous Mississippian farmers of the South, most plant conservationists have treated Chickasaw plums as a widespread wild rather than domesticated species. In 1793, William Bartram noted that he had witnessed Indians gathering and eating plums not in the forest, but in old orchard-like stands long ago planted by the Creek Confederacy. He wrote, "I never saw it wild in the forests, but always in old deserted Indian plantations." The first plums widely propagated by English settlers came from a Creek Indian site in Alabama. It was found along the Tallapoosa River by a Tennessee soldier, one who went by several names, including William Dodd. He was serving as a private in the mounted infantry of the East Tennessee Volunteer Militia that attacked a group of Creek on November 18th, 1813 at the Hillby Villages, about 20 miles from Horseshoe Bend. As the Tennessee soldiers rode away from the Hillbys, he stumbled across some large fruit on the plum trees previously tended by the Creeks. He took pits and took them back to Knox County, where he planted them in 1814. Within a matter of years, they were all the local rage. As Peter Hatch has astutely observed, these plums were adapted to conditions which European cultivars failed miserably. In 2004, field botanists collecting plants for a floral inventory of the Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in Alabama found not one but 7 species of wild plums and cherries surviving near the Creek Tohopeka Village archaeological site. So, to close, even without archaeology, the land remembers more about the distant past than most of us might imagine. While some of what I presented tonight goes beyond what the current archaeological data can support, we have plans to test these hypotheses in future projects. Floral inventories are in progress around a number of other Mississippian sites. We hope perhaps to be able to recover phytoliths, plant opals from deep soil cores at Castalian Springs. Well into my 4th decade of studying the late prehistory of the Cumberland River Valley, we've learned a lot, but we have a lot more exciting questions to try to answer. And that brings me to a close for this evening.
Thanks, Kevin. Great presentation tonight. We really enjoyed that. We have a couple of questions in the chat box, and we have time for maybe to answer 1 or 2 of those. Let's see. Serena Wilson has asked, are there linguistic clues with contemporary bamboo cultures? Are there a lot of words for bamboo or for cane? You're muted.
Okay, so certainly all the southeastern tribes still know about cane. So they have words in their languages today. Dahia is the Cherokee word for cane. I'm not sure if that addresses the question, but yes, I mean, the tribes never lost that understanding of the importance of cane to them. Not nearly so much as our culture did.
And then Dwayne Estes, who you referenced in your presentation, has commented that he loved the presentation and would like to look for room to collaborate on these projects. He's a botanist, as you mentioned. And then Desiree Williams has asked, could the tender inner layers of the cane itself have been eaten as bamboo shoots are today?
Well, certainly Dwayne and I have conversations to have. There are ways that we can examine whether, or try to examine, controlled burning as a means used by Mississippian peoples to manage the landscape. We certainly suspect that they did, but that would require, perhaps we would hope that might be revealed in some of our soil cores. For the eating of the cane, I've not seen any documentary evidence of the use of cane as food. The inner parts of the cane, those tender inner layers, were used to produce fibers that were used to make moccasins, we know. Many different cultures across the country used parts of the cane to produce medicine for a variety of purposes, which is amply documented in this massive volume of, it is massive, I can barely lift it, Native American ethnobotany. So the primary thing that's documented there is the use of the parts of the cane to produce certain kinds of medicines, but not as food that I've seen.
Great. So we are up against our hour here. Let me once again, on behalf of the Division of Archaeology, thank you, Kevin, for serving as our keynote for this series, our kickoff keynote. I'm going to pass it back to Megan, who will close us out here and give you some information on the next speaker in our series.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share this slide really quick with you all. All right, just making a plug for our next several events. Again, they are being hosted once a month through October on the third Thursday of the month at 6 p.m. Central Time. You can find more information on the division's current research in Tennessee Archaeology website. And you can do this through a quick Google search. If you just search TDEC, that's TDEC, Division of Archaeology Research Series, it should be the first hit listed on the Google search. I've also included a link in the chat box. We will be opening up our registration for our next event on May 19th, tomorrow. So please join us, please register online. And again, I'll post that in the chat box. But thank you for joining us this evening. And Dr. Smith, it was a pleasure. Thank you.